What's up guys, welcome back to Tidal Gardens. The coral that I'm going to be covering today are pipe organ corals of the genus Tubipora. They're really not that uncommon, but at the same time not a lot of people have them in the reef tanks. I find that a little weird because they're some of the most beautiful soft corals out there. Pipe organs can vary in appearance from something very similar in appearance to green star polyps to flower-like daisy-shaped polyps. Besides their beautiful polyp structure, the main distinguishing feature is their red skeleton, which is why they're called pipe organs to begin with. Now, I just said that these corals were soft corals, but they have a skeleton? Normally, when a reef hobbyist thinks of the difference between a stony coral and a soft coral, it's all about the fact that the soft coral, let's say this toadstool leather, doesn't form a skeleton. And this stony coral, this Acropora, does. It's a reef-building coral. That logic would make a lot of sense, but really how these corals are classified is all about the symmetry of the polyps. Soft corals are octocoralia, so their symmetry is divisible by 8, octo meaning 8. On the other hand, stony corals are hexacoralia, meaning that their symmetry is divisible by 6. I guess the best analogy that I can think of is imagine like a slice of pizza. And if you have this pizza and the number of slices is divisible by 8, you got an octocoralia, soft coral. If it's divisible by 6, let's say it's got 12 such slices, it's a hexacoralia or stony coral. The fact that a coral actually makes a skeleton, it's more or less a coincidence, because in this case what we have is a soft coral, octocoralia, that deposits this red skeleton. Okay, now why that matters relates a bit when we look at the coral's care requirements. Pipe organs can be a little bit more challenging than a typical soft coral. Your best bet as a hobbyist is to treat them more like a stony coral. What I mean by that is provide a stable source of calcium and alkalinity so they can always be laying down new skeletal growth. This is really important because if the colony is not growing, the coral itself invites problems which I'll talk about in a little bit. As far as lighting goes, I go for a medium light. This coral stays very consistent in appearance. I haven't noticed any real change in coloration from any type of change in light, either the spectrum or the intensity really. I try to keep them under a light in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 par, just to make sure that they're getting enough light for photosynthesis, but not too much light where they might burn up. As for water flow, I kind of like to go towards like the heavier, higher flow end of the spectrum. And the reason is you're going to need some flow to dislodge detritus that might build up in the skeleton. The skeleton has all types of these nooks and crannies, and that invites detritus accumulation. And if you get too much accumulation, it can suffocate those delicate polyps. So it's really important to keep enough flow going through the colony at all times. When it comes to feeding pipe organs, you can go with either a frozen food or some of these powdered foods that are available. I was pleasantly surprised at the performance of some of the powdered stuff. When you just observe it, you can't really tell that they're really grabbing or eating any of these, but in this time lapse you can clearly see that a lot of the dry powders are balanced out to kind of float in the water column, and that gives plenty of time for this type of coral to grab and consume it. If you're going to go with frozen food, I recommend getting that cloudy supernate rather than anything chunky because these polyps are fairly small and they can only grab things that they can fit in their mouth. That's why I like to stick with smaller pieces, things like cyclopes and rotifers. In terms of propagation, pipe organs can be propagated fairly easily, but they're surprisingly slow growing. They appear to be very similar to fast-growing corals such as green star polyps, but because they have to grow this red skeleton, they almost never exhibit this explosive growth that just takes over a tank. Also, this base, you have to be really careful. That whole debris issue is a problem, especially when you start cutting it, because not just debris can get in there, but also predators can get in from the bottom of these tubes, essentially, and kind of get at the coral from the base. So if you're going to glue them down to a substrate, it's very important to go a little bit heavier on the glue to seal up that bottom end of those tubes. One time we actually had a large pipe organ colony And after the first day or so, it just simply would not open up. And we kind of had to do some detective work just to kind of figure this out. And it was only until we started propagating from this colony that we noticed that there was a crab living inside the skeleton. Now, if you think about it, this skeleton makes a really, really good potential home for crustaceans like that crab because it's fairly brittle and it's very easy for them to burrow into something like that compared to, say, live rock. Okay, let's wrap this up. So who is this coral for? I think it's actually for people that are looking for something a little different. Like I mentioned, even though this coral isn't necessarily difficult to acquire or rare in any way, shape, or form, I think it's incredibly underrepresented in the hobby. And again, it has this amazing floral aesthetic that a lot of other corals simply lack. They're not particularly aggressive, so that means that they don't really require a lot of space around each colony. There's no sweeper tentacles or anything like that. And they have modestly slow growth, which makes them a good candidate for smaller tanks that can get easily overrun by very fast growing corals, like green star polyps, for example. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something new about pipe organ corals. I'll see you all next time. Happy reefing.